Thorn was digging for bitter roots in the weeping mire, a task for the desperate, a task he knew well. The dampness of the swamp was a constant companion, a poverty so deep it had seeped into his bones, leaving a permanent ache that echoed the emptiness in his larder. He knew the rules of this broken life. Rule 1. Keep your head down. The world didn't reward heroes, it buried them. Rule 2. Never owe a debt you couldn't pay. Hal Critch, the town reeve, kept ledgers written in ink and misery, and Veland's name was on every other page. And especially Rule 3, the most important rule of all. Monsters were monsters. Orcs were walking nightmares, engines of destruction, the ancient enemy. You see an orc, you run, or you die. But when he stumbled upon the edge of the grieving fen and found the orc female sinking slowly into the greedy, bubbling quicksand, her massive form trapped and exhausted, he broke the most important rule of all. He didn't run. And that choice, that single, foolish, compassionate choice, changed everything. The mire stank of decay and forgotten things. Villain's stomach was a tight, aching knot, a familiar sensation he usually ignored. But today, the hunger was sharp, clawing at him as he worked the damp earth with a worn-out trowel. Each fibrous root he pulled from the mud was a small victory against the creeping void. It wasn't food for a king. It was barely food for a man. But it was something. He had wandered farther than usual, pushed by that gnawing emptiness. The familiar woods gave way to the twisted, skeletal trees of the grieving fen. A place whispered about in the village tavern. A place of bad air and worse luck. The ground grew soft and treacherous under his worn boots. He should have turned back, any sensible person would have. That's when he heard it. Not a roar, not a cry for help, a sound of immense frustrated effort. A deep guttural grunt, followed by the sickening sucking sound of thick mud. It was close, too close. Fear, cold and immediate, washed over him. His first instinct was to drop his meager harvest and flee. That was the rule. That was survival. But his fatal flaw, the one his father had warned him about, was a stubborn inability to ignore suffering. It was a weakness, he knew. A crack in the armor a poor man needed to wear. He crept forward, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He peered through a curtain of hanging moss, his breath catching in his throat. There, in a clearing where the ground turned to a shimmering brown sludge, was an orc, a female. She was huge, a mountain of green-skinned muscle, clad in scraps of leather and iron, tusked, powerful, the very image of the monsters from the old war stories. But she was no monster of legend now. She was a creature trapped. The quicksand had her to her waist, a slow, inexorable beast dragging her down. On her back, lashed to her with thick leather straps, was a small bundle. A child. No, an orc child. Young, small, his face pale and still. Unconscious, or worse. Her struggles were weakening. Each heave of her powerful shoulders only made the mire suck her deeper. Her face, a mask of fierce lines and proud angles, was slick with sweat and etched with a desperation that transcended species. It was a look Villain knew. He saw it in the mirror every morning, the look of someone at the end of their rope. He watched, hidden, for a long moment. His mind screamed at him, "Run! Go! This isn't your fight. She would kill you on sight. Thank you for the rescue by putting a tusk through your throat." The stories were clear. The old soldiers in the village, men with missing limbs and haunted eyes, had made sure of that. Orcs knew only blood and ruin. But then her eyes, burning like hot coals in the dim light, flickered toward the still form of the child on her back. A wave of something agonizingly gentle passed over her harsh features. A fierce, protective love. It was so profoundly familiar, so deeply understandable, that it shattered the wall of prejudice in his mind. That wasn't a monster. That was a mother, or a sister, a protector, and she was dying. Damn the rules. Damn the stories. Villain stepped out from behind the moss. The orc's head snapped toward him. A low growl rumbled in her chest, a sound like grinding stones. Her hand, thick-fingered and strong, went to the hilt of a crude axe tucked into her belt, but the movement only sank her deeper. Her eyes narrowed, filled with hate and fear. He was human. The enemy. Villain held up his empty hands. A gesture of peace. A gesture of utter foolishness. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It felt absurd to say it to a creature that could likely snap him in two. She spat a harsh, guttural word at him. It sounded like a curse. "I want to help," he tried again, pointing at the quicksand, then making a pulling motion with his hands. She watched him, her suspicion a palpable force. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the warrior's pride warring with the protector's desperation. To accept help from a human, a weak-looking, scrawny male at that, must have been a humiliation beyond measure. But the child on her back was a silent, compelling argument. Villain didn't wait for her permission. His mind, accustomed to solving problems with no resources, started working. The ground around the pit was unstable. He couldn't just walk up and pull. He needed leverage. He needed a rope. He scanned the clearing. His eyes landed on a long dead branch, thick as his thigh, lying near the edge of the fen. Perfect. He then began tearing at the thick, woody vines that choked the trees, his hands already raw from digging roots. He worked with a feverish haste, his fear giving way to a singular focus. He twisted the vines together, weaving a makeshift rope. It wasn't pretty, but it might be strong enough. The orc watched his every move, silent and tense. She had stopped struggling, conserving her energy. She was intelligent. She understood what he was trying to do. He tied one end of his vine rope around the base of a sturdy, living tree. He looped the other end, creating a handle. This was the moment of truth. He had to get the rope to her. He edged as close as he dared to the shimmering pit, the ground squelching ominously under his boots. "I'm going to throw this to you," he called out, holding up the rope. "Grab it." He swung the vine, putting all of his meager strength into the toss. It fell short, landing in the mud with a sad splat. The orc let out another frustrated grunt. "Sorry," he muttered, pulling the rope back, his arms aching. He tried again. This time it landed closer, within her reach. Her powerful hand shot out and clamped around the vine. She tested it, her muscles bulging. The vine held, her eyes met his across the pit, and for the first time the raw hatred was gone, replaced by a flicker of something else, a grudging acknowledgement. "Okay," Villain breathed, his own exhaustion setting in. "Now, the branch." He dragged the heavy branch to the edge of the pit, positioning it over a gnarled root that could serve as a fulcrum. He shoved one end under the vine rope she held. The other end was his lever. It was a simple machine, a desperate, flimsy hope. "When I push down, you pull," he instructed, using gestures. "Pull." He put his entire body weight onto the end of the branch. The wood groaned. The vine went taut, straining against the tree. He felt a terrible, sharp pain in his shoulder, the protest of a body fueled by little more than watery soup and stale bread. Across the pit, the orc roared, a true battle cry this time, and heaved. Muscle and leverage versus the insatiable mire. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The mud held its prize fast. Then, with a great, wet, tearing sound, she moved. An inch, then another. It was brutal, punishing work. Villain's world shrank to the straining wood of the branch, the fire in his muscles, and the grunts of effort from the trapped orc. He pushed, she pulled. The sun dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows through the twisted trees. His vision started to blur at the edges. He was going to collapse. "Again," he gasped, forcing himself to push one more time. With a final, desperate surge, she lunged forward, her upper body clearing the edge of the quicksand. She clawed at the solid ground, her fingers digging into the earth, and dragged herself inch by painful inch onto the muddy bank. She lay there, panting, covered in foul-smelling sludge. A colossal, exhausted heap of warrior and mud. The child on her back had not stirred. Villain collapsed backward, his strength utterly spent. He lay on the damp ground, chest heaving, staring up at the darkening sky. He had done it. He had saved an orc. The most foolish, rule-breaking act of his entire life. After a long silence, punctuated only by their ragged breathing, she pushed herself up. She moved with a stiff, aching grace, untying the straps that held the young one. She cradled the small orc in her arms, her movements surprisingly gentle. She checked his breathing, her expression unreadable. Villain pushed himself into a sitting position, every muscle screaming in protest. Now what? Now she kills me. The thought was distant, detached. He was too tired to even be properly afraid. She turned her head and looked at him. Her gaze was intense, analytical. She saw his tattered clothes, his thin frame, the exhaustion that clung to him like a shroud. She saw the discarded trowel and the handful of pathetic roots. She saw not a threat, but a fellow sufferer. She gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture of profound, ancient honor. It wasn't thanks. It was an acknowledgement of a debt. An honorable act had been performed. It would be met in kind. That much was clear in her steady gaze. Then she looked at the path leading back toward the village, then back at him, a question in her eyes. She needed shelter. The child was sick or hurt. The night was growing cold, and Villain, the man who knew the rules, the man who was already drowning in his own poverty and debt, found himself doing the unthinkable. He stood up, wincing, and picked up his meager roots. He gestured for her to follow him. His hovel was barely a house. It was more of a suggestion of a shelter, leaning tiredly against the edge of the woods that bordered the village. The roof was a patchwork of mossy thatch and hope, and it leaked in 3 places. The door hung on one good hinge. Poverty was a dampness that had settled deep into the walls, a permanent mold on his life. When he pushed the door open, the orc female had to duck to enter. She filled the tiny single room, her presence making it feel impossibly small. She laid the young one down gently on Villain's own cot, the only piece of furniture in the room other than a rickety table and a stool. It was a pallet of straw with a threadbare blanket, but it was dry. In the dim light of his single tallow candle, he could see them more clearly. Her skin was a deep forest green, crisscrossed with old scars. One of her tusks was chipped. She was a warrior, no doubt. The boy, her brother perhaps, was paler, his features softer. A feverish heat radiated from his skin. Silence descended. A heavy, awkward silence, thick with unspoken questions and the ancient chasm between their species. What had he done? He had brought a monster into his home. 2 monsters. If anyone saw, Hal Critch would have him flogged. The village would form a mob. He looked at the orc child, shivering on the cot. He looked at the female, standing guard, her exhaustion warring with a fierce, protective vigilance. And he saw not monsters, but refugees. He walked over to his small, mostly empty larder. Inside was a half loaf of stale bread and a small wedge of hard cheese. It was his food for the next 2 days. Without thinking, he took it all. He broke the bread, put it on his only plate with the cheese, and filled his only cup with water from the rain barrel. He set the plate and cup on the floor before her, an offering. She looked down at the meager meal. Then she looked at him, at his gaunt face and hollow eyes. She understood the sacrifice. It was everything he had. Her gaze softened for a fraction of a second. She picked up a piece of the bread, broke it in half, and held one half out to him. Villain stared at the offering, an orc, sharing her food with him. A bond was being forged in that tiny, broken-down shack, a bond of shared desperation. He took the bread. They ate in silence, the sound of their chewing loud in the quiet room. It was the strangest, most profound meal of his life. A shared communion between outcasts. When they were done, she pointed to the boy. then to her own head, and made a gesture of pain. He was sick. The fever. Vilain knew a little of herbs, things his mother had taught him. Willow bark for fever, yarrow for wounds. He nodded and went to a small pouch hanging from a nail. He took out a handful of dried willow bark and dropped it into the cup. Adding more water. He heated it by holding the cup over the candle flame, a slow and tedious process. He handed the warm, bitter tea to her. She took it, smelled it cautiously, then gently lifted the boy's head and coaxed a few sips between his lips. Then she settled onto the floor beside the cot, her back against the damp wall, her axe within arm's reach. Her eyes never fully closed. She would stand watch. She would protect her charge. And he realized she would protect the human who had shown her an impossible kindness. Vilain sat on his stool, watching the candle flicker. He had broken every rule. He had invited the wild woods into his home. He was terrified. And yet, for the first time in a long time, his tiny, leaking hovel did not feel empty. If you believe that kindness matters more than species, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps us share more stories about unlikely heroes. Now, back to Vilain's decision, because things were about to get dangerous. The next few days passed in a strange, hushed rhythm. A secret truce held within the 4 crumbling walls of Vilain's home. The orc female, who he learned was named Garza, and her younger brother Mock became his silent houseguests. Mock's fever raged for 2 days, a fiery battle in his small body. Vilain kept him supplied with willow bark tea, and Garza kept vigil, cleaning the boy with a damp rag, her huge, scarred hands moving with a tenderness that was breathtaking to witness. During this time, Garza did not speak his language, and he did not speak hers. They communicated through a language of gesture and intent, a nod, a pointed finger, a shared glance. When Vilain's food ran out completely, he prepared to go foraging again, his stomach a hollow drum. Garza stopped him at the door. She held up a hand, then pointed to herself, then to the woods. She would provide. It was a matter of honor. The debt was not yet paid. He was hesitant. An orc hunting so close to the village of Barrows Deep was a recipe for disaster. But the look in her eyes was resolute. She was a warrior and a provider. To deny her this was to deny her honor. He relented with a nod. She returned near dusk, moving like a shadow through the trees. She hadn't brought a deer or a boar, the kind of prey he imagined an orc would hunt. Instead, she carried 3 plump rabbits and a pouch full of earthy, unfamiliar mushrooms. She had hunted with a subtlety that belied her size, a skill learned in lands far different from these. That night, they feasted. Vilain cooked the rabbits over his small fire, and Garza showed him which of the mushrooms were safe to eat, crushing them into a savory paste. The smell of roasting meat filled the hovel, a scent of impossible luxury. It was more than he had eaten in a month. As they ate, Mock, his fever finally broken, sat up on the cot and weakly chewed a piece of meat Garza tore for him. He watched Vilain with wide, curious eyes, not with fear, but with a child's simple wonder. A fragile domesticity began to settle over them. They were a bizarre family of circumstance. Garza, seeing the constant drip of water from the ceiling, decided the roof was an offense to her warrior's sensibilities. She hauled herself onto it, intending to fix it. Her methods were direct. She tore away the rotten thatch with her bare hands, but her strength was too much for the frail structure. A large section of the roof beam, already weakened by rot, cracked under her weight and crashed into the hovel. Vilain rushed out to find her looking at the new, gaping hole with an expression of profound frustration. He couldn't help it. A small laugh escaped him. It was a rusty, unused sound. Garza looked at him, her brow furrowed, and then a low rumble started in her chest. It wasn't a growl, it was a laugh. A deep, throaty sound like rocks tumbling down a hillside. In that moment, sharing a laugh over a broken roof, the last of Vilain's fear melted away. He climbed up and, with gestures, showed her how to weave the new thatch he had gathered, how to brace the beam instead of tearing it out. He worked with his knowledge of flimsy structures, and she worked with her immense strength. Together, they fixed the roof. For the first time in years, Vilen's home was completely dry. Trust was a fragile seed, planted in the mud of the grieving fen, and now in the shared work and laughter, it began to sprout. Gaza started teaching him things. She showed him which plants in the forest could be used to make potent salves for wounds, and which roots, different from the bitter ones he knew, were full of energy. She tried to teach him how to use a knife for defense, but his movements were clumsy, his body too accustomed to weakness. Still, she was patient. He, in turn, taught her words in his tongue. Water, fire, home. She learned quickly, her voice shaping the foreign sounds with a gruff precision. Mok, being a child, learned even faster, pointing at things and demanding their names. Key, he said one evening, pointing at the small, rusty key Vilen always wore on a leather cord around his neck. Yes, key, Vilen said, touching the familiar object. It was worthless. It belonged to a chest his parents had sold long ago to pay a debt to Howl Critch's father. It was the only thing he had left of them, a key to a home he never had. It's a memory. Gaza watched the exchange, her expression thoughtful. She understood the concept of a sentimental object. Honor and memory were pillars of her own culture, but their quiet, hidden world could not last. Barrows Deep was a small village. Secrets were a commodity, and they rarely stayed secret for long. Old Man Hemlock, a wizened trapper who checked his lines in the woods, saw her. He didn't see a refugee fixing a roof. He saw a green-skinned monster 50 yards from the village. He saw death and destruction. He ran back to the village, his heart pounding with terror. The story flew from his lips in the tavern, growing with each telling. It wasn't just an orc, it was a war party. Vilen Thorn, that strange, quiet man on the edge of town, was consorting with them. He was a traitor. Fear was a poison, and it spread quickly. The villagers, already struggling with a poor harvest and the heavy hand of the reeve, were primed for a scapegoat. The ancient prejudice, a wall built of fear and old wars, was resurrected in an instant. They remembered the stories of burning villages and wailing sirens. They didn't see the individual, they saw the symbol. The first sign of trouble was the silence. When Vilen went into the village for supplies, paid for with the pelts of Gaza's rabbits, the people turned away from him. Mothers pulled their children close. The blacksmith refused to sell him nails. The baker, who had sometimes slipped him a day-old loaf out of pity, stared at him with cold eyes. He was an outcast before. Now he was a pariah. The second sign was far more direct. Howl Critch arrived at his hovel. Critch was a man whose soul had been replaced by a ledger. He was thin and pale, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that were always calculating. He saw the world in terms of profit and loss, debt and payment. Vilen was a long-standing, frustratingly unprofitable entry in his book. He didn't come alone. He brought 2 burly guards, men whose loyalty was bought with coin. They stood behind him, their hands on their cudgels, looking bored and mean. "Thorn," Critch said, his voice thin and reedy. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He sniffed the air, his nose wrinkling. "Something's different. The hovel seems sturdier. And you look better fed. Found a secret benefactor, have we?" Vilen's heart hammered against his ribs. Gaza and Mok were inside, silent as stones. He had told them to hide if anyone came. "I've had some luck with trapping," he said, his voice steady despite the fear. Critch smiled, a bloodless stretching of his lips. "Luck. Yes, I've heard rumors of your luck. They say your luck has green skin and tusks." Vilen stood his ground, positioning himself in front of his door. "They're just stories," reaved Critch. "People are scared. The harvest is bad." "Oh, I know they're scared," Critch said, stepping closer. He tapped a rolled-up parchment he held in his hand. "Which is why I'm here. Your debt, Thorn. It is substantial. My father was too soft on you. Your parents' debt passed to you with interest accrued over 20 years. A staggering sum." He unrolled the parchment. It was covered in spidery black script. "By my authority as Reeve of Barrows Deep, I am here to collect. In full." "You know I can't pay that," Villain said quietly. "It's impossible." "Of course it is," Critch said smoothly. "But the law is the law. Payment is due. However," he leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "the law also provides for alternatives. Forfeiture of property, for instance." He gestured at the pathetic hovel and the small patch of land it sat on. "This is worthless," Villain said. "You know that. To me, perhaps, but there are interested parties. Prospectors believe there might be iron deposits in these woods, and a clear title is required." Critch's eyes glinted with greed. "But there is another way. A way to clear your entire debt." He looked past Villain toward the closed door of the hovel. "There are whispers of a deserter from the Skullrender clan, a warrior of some note. The warlord, Thrathrak, has put out a bounty. A very, very generous bounty. Enough to clear your debt and make you a rich man, Thorn." The blood drained from Villain's face. Critch knew. Or he suspected enough to use it as a weapon. He was offering Villain a choice: betray Gaza or lose everything. "I don't know what you're talking about," Villain said, his voice thick. Critch's smile vanished. "Don't play the fool with me. I have witnesses who saw an orc near this hovel. The village is terrified. They want it gone. I'm giving you a chance to be the hero, to solve everyone's problem and your own." He held out the parchment. "You have until the next full moon. 1 week. Either you deliver the orc to me, or I return with a writ of eviction and a dozen men to burn this shack to the ground, with you in it, if necessary. And then I will send word to Warlord Thrathrak myself. He will find his quarry one way or another. The bounty may as well be mine." He rolled up the parchment and tapped it against Villain's chest. "Think about it, Thorn. Your life of poverty, over. Or your life, just over." Critch turned and walked away, his guards falling in behind him. The silence he left behind was heavier than any sound. Villain stood there for a long time, the Reeves ultimatum echoing in his ears. The dampness of poverty felt warm compared to the icy grip of this new, impossible choice. He could save himself. He could be free of the debt that had choked his family for generations. All he had to do was sell the life of the woman who had shared her food with him, who had laughed with him, who had trusted him. He finally pushed the door open and went inside. Gaza was standing in the center of the room, her hand resting on her axe. Mock was peeking out from behind her legs. She had heard everything. Her face was a mask of stone, but her eyes held a deep, sorrowful understanding. She knew the choice he had been given. She knew the weight of the debt, the power of a man like Critch. She expected the betrayal. It was the way of the world. Villain looked at her, at this powerful warrior who had shown him nothing but honor. He looked at Mock, a child who had just begun to smile at him. He looked at the sturdy, dry roof they had built together. This wasn't just a hovel anymore. It was a home. They were not just guests. They were family, a chosen family, forged in desperation and sealed with trust. He walked over to the small table and sat down, his head in his hands. The weight of the world was on his shoulders. But the choice was not as hard as Critch believed. It wasn't a choice at all. He looked up at Gaza. He didn't have the words to explain the complexities of debt and human greed. He could only offer a simple truth. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said, his voice firm. He pointed at her, then at himself and Mock. He made a circle with his hands, encompassing them all. Family. Garza stared at him, her hard expression faltering. A flicker of disbelief, of shock crossed her features. He would choose them? Over his own freedom? Over his own life? She had been hunted, betrayed, and exiled. She had expected no different from this strange, weak human. But he was not like the others. His kindness wasn't a trick, it was a weapon, a shield. Slowly, she knelt down in front of him. It was a gesture of immense significance, a warrior kneeling to a non-combatant. From a pouch at her belt, she withdrew a small object. It was a piece of wood, intricately carved into the shape of a snarling wolf's head. The wood was a deep, lustrous red, unlike any he had ever seen. A heartwood. She held it out to him in the palm of her hand. It was not a payment. It was a pledge, an oath. Family, she repeated, her voice a low rumble. She had learned the word, and she understood its meaning completely. Vilaine took the carving. Its surface was warm, almost alive to the touch. It was a promise. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The debt, the reeve, the warlord, all of it. Can you believe they did that? If you're rooting for this strange family to survive, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Comment below. Would you have opened your door? But hold on, because Hal Critch wasn't finished yet. The week passed with the slowness of a coming storm. A heavy, charged atmosphere hung over the hovel and the village of Barrows Deep. Villain, Garza, and Mock existed on their small island of defiance, a fragile fortress against a sea of fear and greed. They spoke little of Critch's threat. There was nothing to say. The decision had been made. Now, they could only prepare. Garza took to sharpening her axe with a whetstone she had carried from her homeland. The scrape of stone on steel was a constant, rhythmic sound in the small cabin. A song of impending battle. She was a warrior preparing for her last stand. She tried to teach Villain more, how to use his weight, how to strike at weak points, how to think like a fighter. He was a clumsy student, his body unaccustomed to violence, but he listened, he learned, he had to. Kindness was his shield, but he feared it would not be enough. He, in turn, stockpiled what little he could. He gathered herbs not just for healing, but for smoke, for irritants, anything that could be used to create a diversion. He reinforced the door with a new, sturdy crossbar he fashioned from a fallen branch. It was a pitiful defense against a dozen armed men, but it was something. It was an act of defiance. The bond between them deepened in these tense days. They were no longer a human and two orcs. They were a unit. Mock, now fully recovered, seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. The boy, who should have been playing, instead practiced with a small wooden stick, mimicking Garza's fighting stances. He would stand guard at the window, a tiny, solemn sentinel, and report any movement from the direction of the village. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood, Garza spoke. She had been learning his language with a fierce determination, and now she had enough words to tell him her story. Not deserter, she said, her voice low and rough. Exile. She told him of her clan, the Bloodfang clan. They were not the mindless savages of human stories. They were a proud people with a code of honor that stretched back for generations. Her father had been the chieftain, a strong and wise leader, but he valued honor over conquest, prosperity over power. Then came Thrathrak. Thrathrak Skullrender. He was her father's greatest warrior, bloodthirsty and ambitious. He saw her father's peace as weakness. He craved the old ways, the days of raiding and ruin. He poisoned the minds of the younger warriors with promises of glory and plunder. He made coup. Garza struggled for the word. Killed my father. In his sleep, no honor. Thrathrak declared himself the new chieftain. He wanted Gaza as his mate, to legitimize his rule. She was her father's daughter, a powerful symbol. When she refused, spitting in his face, he marked her for death. But some of her father's loyalists helped her escape in the dead of night, along with Mok, her only living family. Her little brother, the true heir to the chieftainship by their laws, as she was a warrior, not a ruler. Thrathrak hunts us, she finished, her hand resting on Mok's head. He wants Mok dead. He wants the symbol. She pointed to the small carved wolf head he had given Vilen. That is a copy, a test. He wants the real one. The story settled in the small room, heavy as a shroud. She wasn't a criminal. She was a princess in exile, protecting the rightful king. The weight on Vilen's shoulders grew heavier. He wasn't just hiding a refugee, he was harboring royalty and defying a warlord. The day of the full moon arrived, pale and ominous. The air was still, the woods were silent. They waited. Just after midday, they came. Howell Critch was at the front, as promised, his face a pinched mask of righteous greed. Behind him were not a dozen men, but nearly 20. Some were his personal guards, but others were villagers. Men Vilen had known his whole life. Farmers, woodsmen, the baker. Their faces were a mixture of fear, anger, and shame. They carried pitchforks, axes, and cudgels. A mob. "Thorn!" Critch's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence. "Your time is up. I am here to execute the writ of eviction, and to claim the bounty on the monster you are harboring." Vilen looked at Gaza. Her hand was on her axe. Her eyes were burning with a cold fire. She was ready to die fighting. "Stay inside," Vilen said. "Protect Mok. Let me talk to them." "They will kill you," she rumbled. "Maybe," he said, touching the rusty key around his neck. It felt cool against his skin. "But they are my people. I have to try." He unbarred the door and stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind him. He stood on his own small patch of earth, a thin, weary man facing down a tide of hatred. He held his hands up, open and empty. "Go home," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "This is not your fight." "It is our fight," shouted the blacksmith, a man named Jorund. "You brought a beast to our doorstep. You put our children in danger." "There is no beast here," Vilen said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, meeting the eyes of the men he knew. "There is only a family, a mother protecting her child." Critch laughed, a high, mocking sound. "A mother? It's an orc, you fool. A killer. It will tear you all apart the moment you turn your backs. I am saving you from your own sentimentality. Now, stand aside or we will go through you." Vilen stood his ground. He was terrified. His knees were shaking. But the memory of Gaza sharing her bread, of their shared laughter over the broken roof, of Mok's trusting eyes, it formed a spine of iron within him. This was his home. This was his family. "No," he said. "Weak fool," Critch sneered. He gestured to his guards. "Seize him." Two of the guards started forward, cudgels raised. Vilen braced himself. He was going to die, right here, on his own land, for a choice he would make again in a heartbeat. But before they could reach him, a new sound split the air. A deep, menacing war horn echoing from the woods behind the mob. It was not a human horn. It was guttural, brutal. The villagers froze, turning to look. Emerging from the trees was a new group, orcs, a dozen of them clad in black iron and cruel spikes. They were larger, more menacing than Gaza, their faces twisted into permanent snarls. At their head was a colossal figure, an orc so large he dwarfed the others. His skin was the color of a fresh bruise, and his face was a roadmap of horrific scars. One of his tusks was capped in black iron, shaped into a jagged point. In one hand, he carried a massive twin-bladed axe that seemed to drink the very light from the air. Thrathrak Skullrender had arrived. Critch's face went pale. He had sent word, yes, but he had not expected the warlord to come himself, and with such a force. He had expected a quiet transaction, a bag of gold, not an invasion. Thrathrak's cold, dead eyes scanned the scene. He saw the mob of terrified humans. He saw the smirking Reeve. And he saw Villain, standing alone before the hovel. "The Reeve of this dung-heap village sent word." Thrathrak's voice was a gravelly roar, speaking the common tongue with a heavy, brutal accent. "He said you had something of mine." His gaze fixed on the hovel door. "Gaza, I smell your stink. You cannot hide from me forever. Come out and die with honor." The villagers began to back away, their bravado evaporating in the face of the real, legendary monster. This was not the frightened creature of their imagination. This was a warlord, and he had brought his war with him. The door to the hovel creaked open. Gaza emerged, Mock held tightly behind her. She held her axe in a two-handed grip, planting herself between Thrathrak and Villain, a protector to the last. "Thrathrak," she spat his name like a curse. "You have no honor. You are a poison in the blood of our people." Thrathrak laughed, a horrible, grating sound. "Honor? Your father's honor got him a knife in the dark and a shallow grave. I rule the clan now, and I will have the Bloodfang seal. Give it to me and I will grant the boy a quick death." This was the moment. The public confrontation, the truth revealed. All the players were on the stage. The greedy official, the bloodthirsty warlord, the desperate warrior, and the weak human who had stood up for her. Villain saw Critch trying to sidle away, to melt back into the crowd. "You!" Villain's voice rang out, filled with a strength he didn't know he possessed. "Critch, this is what you wanted. This is the bounty you were so eager to claim." All eyes, human and orc, turned to the Reeve. Thrathrak's gaze narrowed. "So, you are the maggot who sent the message." Critch began to sweat profusely. "I was merely enforcing the law, Warlord Thrathrak. This man, Thorn, was harboring your fugitive." "Silence!" Thrathrak roared. "I make deals with no one." The situation was a powder keg. Thrathrak's warriors were tensed, ready to charge. The villagers were trapped between two nightmare factions, and at the center of it all was Villain, Gaza, and a small boy. It was Villain who spoke, his voice cutting through the tension. He turned not to Thrathrak, but to his own people. "Look at this," he cried, gesturing to Gaza. "You call her a monster? This woman has more honor in her chipped tusk than a man like Critch has in his entire body. You talk of debt? I was born into debt to him. My family starved to pay him. Is that justice? Is that the community we are?" He held up the rusty key from his neck. "This key belonged to a home my parents lost to his father's ledgers. This is the legacy of Barrows Deep, a legacy of debt and fear. But Gaza, she showed me a different way, a legacy of honor." He turned to face Thrathrak, his heart a wild drum. "You want the Bloodfang seal. You want the symbol of chieftainship. You are not worthy to look upon it." Thrathrak's face contorted in a mask of fury. "You, a pathetic human worm, dare to speak to me of worthiness? I will flay the skin from your bones." "No," a calm voice said. It was Gaza. She stepped forward, her eyes locked with Thrathrak's. The moment had come. The weak human had stood for the strong orc. Now it was her turn. "You hunt a symbol, Thrathrak," she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "You believe it will give you legitimacy. But the seal is not just an object. It is a truth. It reveals the heart of the one who holds it." From a hidden pouch sewn into the lining of her leather armor, she withdrew another object. It was not a carving. It was a solid, heavy-looking amulet of polished obsidian, shaped into a snarling wolf's head. In the center of the wolf's forehead was a single deep red stone that seemed to pulse with a faint, inner light. The true Bloodfang seal. "The legends are true," she declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the clearing. "The heartstone of the Fang shows the truth of the chieftain's spirit. My father's spirit was strong and clear. Let us see yours, usurper." Thrathrak's eyes widened, first in greed, then in a flicker of uncertainty. The legend of the Heartstone was ancient, half forgotten. Most thought it was just a story. Before he could react, Gaza held the seal aloft. She spoke a single sharp word in the old Orcish tongue. A word of power. The Heartstone flared, not with a warm red light, but with a sickly, blackish-purple glow. The light projected from the stone, not a beam, but a swirling, smoky image in the air above them. It showed a figure slinking through the dark. It showed a knife flashing. It showed a wise, old chieftain dying not in battle, but in betrayal. It showed Thrathrak's face, twisted in a triumphant, dishonorable sneer, over the body of Gaza's father. It showed the truth. A collective gasp went through Thrathrak's own warriors. They had followed him for his strength, for his promises of glory. But they were still bloodfangs. They still held to the remnants of the old code. To murder a chieftain in his sleep, it was the ultimate dishonor. Unforgivable. Thrathrak stared at the damning image, his face a picture of horror and rage. "Lies! Witchcraft!" he roared. But his own men were looking at him now with disgust and dawning fury. "He is no chieftain," Gaza's voice boomed. "He is a coward and a murderer. I, Gaza, daughter of Korgash, rightful guardian of the Bloodfang clan, name him traitor." One of Thrathrak's warriors, a grizzled veteran with a scarred face, spat on the ground at Thrathrak's feet. "The woman speaks the truth. The stone does not lie. We followed a snake." Thrathrak, seeing his power crumble before his eyes, let out a bellow of pure rage. He raised his massive axe. If he could not have their loyalty, he would have their blood. He charged not at Gaza, but at the closest, easiest target. He charged at Vilain. It happened in an instant. The colossal orc, a whirlwind of rage and steel, bearing down on the frail human. Vilain had no time to run, no time to even cry out. But he was not alone. Gaza moved like a thunderbolt. She didn't try to meet his charge head-on. She was strong, but he was stronger. She used the lessons she had tried to teach Vilain: speed, precision, and weakness. She sidestepped his wild swing and slammed the butt of her axe into the back of his knee. His leg buckled with a wet, cracking sound. Thrathrak roared in pain and surprise, stumbling. In that moment of imbalance, Gaza's own warriors acted. The grizzled veteran and two others leaped forward, their own axes flashing. They did not cheer. They did not shout. They administered the clan's justice, swift and brutal. Thrathrak's skull render fell, not in glorious battle, but in a dishonorable heap, brought down by the truth and the blades of his own men. Silence descended upon the clearing. A profound, stunned silence. The grizzled orc warrior approached Gaza. He dropped to one knee, bowing his head. "Lady Gaza," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Forgive us. We were blind." The other warriors followed his lead, kneeling in the mud before her and the small boy who peeked out from behind her legs. The civil war of the Bloodfang clan was over. Gaza looked at her kneeling warriors. She looked at the body of the usurper. Then her gaze found Vilain, who was standing, pale and shaking, but alive. She walked to him, ignoring her own people for a moment. She gently took the rusty key from his neck and held it in her palm next to the glowing Bloodfang seal. "This," she said, holding up the seal, "is the key to my people." Then she held up his worthless, rusty key. "And this is the key to my family." She placed the key back in his hand and closed his fingers around it. In front of the stunned villagers and the kneeling orc warriors, she placed a hand on his shoulder. A gesture of ultimate respect. A declaration. This human was one of them. He was under her protection. He was clan. The villagers of Barrows Deep stared, their pitchforks hanging limply in their hands. They had come to drive out a monster. Instead, they had witnessed the fall of a tyrant and the rise of a queen. And they had seen their neighbor, poor, weak villain Thorn, stand at the very center of it all, armed with nothing but kindness. As for Hal Critch, he tried to flee in the chaos. But Joran the blacksmith, his face a mask of shame and newfound clarity, stepped in his path. The Reeves' reign of greed was over. The aftermath was not a sudden, magical fix. It was the slow, difficult dawn after a long night. The world had been turned upside down in a single afternoon. The body of Thrathrak and his few loyalists were taken away by the Bloodfang warriors for a nameless burial, the fate of traitors. The rest of the warriors, now loyal to Gaza, made a temporary camp in the woods, awaiting her command. Hal Critch was brought before a village council, held that very evening in the tavern. For the first time, it was not a place of fear, but of accounting. Vilaine was there, with Gaza standing silently at his side. Her presence alone was enough to ensure the proceedings were honest. The story of Critch's dealings with Thrathrak, his attempt to sell a refugee for a bounty, came to light, confirmed by a dozen shamed witnesses. His ledgers, once symbols of his power, were brought out and examined. They revealed decades of predatory lending and extortion. The anger in the room was a palpable thing. He was stripped of his title as Reeve and exiled from Barrow's Deep, a fate he had so casually tried to inflict on Vilaine. He left with nothing but the clothes on his back, his ledgers burning in a bonfire in the village square, a symbolic cleansing of the town's long-held debt. But the biggest change was in the people themselves. The prejudice, that ancient wall, had not vanished, but it was deeply cracked. They had seen Vilaine's iron-willed compassion. They had seen Gaza's honor. They had looked a real monster in the eye. And it was not the orc female, but the warlord and the greedy Reeve. They looked at Vilaine differently now. He was no longer the village outcast. He was their conscience. Gaza, for her part, had a clan to lead. Her warriors urged her to return to their mountain fortress, to reclaim her father's seat and bring the clan to order. But she did not leave immediately. A debt of honor was still owed, and a home had been made here. She met with the new village council, Vilaine acting as her interpreter and advisor. She was not a conqueror. She was a diplomat. She proposed a treaty, the first of its kind. Her people needed resources to rebuild after Thrathrak's ruinous reign. The forests around Barrow's Deep were rich with iron and timber. The village needed protection and a stable trading partner. An agreement was struck. The Bloodfang clan would be permitted to establish a supervised mining and logging operation in the farther woods, away from the village, in exchange for a share of the resources and a pact of mutual defense. Orcs and humans, neighbors, not enemies. It was a radical idea, one that would take generations to fully cement, but the first stone was laid. And Gaza did not forget her first ally. Using a small portion of the clan's treasury, gold and gems that Thrathrak had hoarded, she bought Vilaine's hovel and the surrounding land from the village, securing his title for good. The debt was finally, truly gone. But they didn't just leave the hovel as it was. A new project began. Bloodfang warriors, their strength now turned to construction instead of destruction, worked alongside village carpenters. They tore down the old, rotting structure. In its place, they built a new house. A real house. It was made of sturdy oak from the forest and stone from the hills. It had a strong roof that didn't leak, a fireplace that drew perfectly, and glass in the windows. It was half human design, half orcish strength, a symbol of the new union. Vilaine would often stand and watch them work, a sense of dazed wonder on his face. He, who had owned nothing, who had expected to die in poverty, now stood before a home built by the hands of two peoples. Mock would play at his feet, chasing butterflies, his laughter a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. Gaza eventually had to leave. Her duty as chieftain called her home to the mountains. The parting was not one of sadness, but of promise. "This is your home," she told Vilaine, standing on the porch of the new house. "But you and Mok will always have a home with me in the Bloodfang halls. You are family." Mok, however, did not go with her. By their clan's law, the heir could be fostered with a trusted ally for his protection and education until he came of age. Gaza asked Vilaine to raise him, to teach him the compassion and quiet strength that she had come to value more than a warrior's rage. It was the ultimate gesture of trust. So Vilaine, the man who once had nothing, now had a home, a son, and a future. He became the official envoy between Barrows Deep and the Bloodfang clan, a bridge between two worlds. He was respected. He was important. But to him, his greatest treasure was the quiet evenings, sitting by the fire with Mok, teaching him how to read, the boy's head resting on his lap. The house was no longer on the edge of the village. The village grew towards it. A new community began to form, a place where a human trader might share a drink with an orc miner, where children, human and orc, might one day play without a second thought. It was not perfect. There were still arguments, still moments of fear and mistrust. But the seed of trust had been planted, and it was growing. Different no longer meant enemy. It just meant different. Years later, Vilaine stood on his porch watching the sunset. He was no longer the gaunt, weary man from the swamp. His face had filled out, and his eyes, once hollow, were now calm and clear. He held the old, rusty key in his hand, its edges worn smooth from years of touch. It hadn't opened a chest of gold. It had opened a door to a life he could never have imagined. It had unlocked a future not just for him, but for two entire peoples. Mok, now a strapping young lad, half orcish strength and half human kindness, came and stood beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Thinking again, father?" he asked, his voice a pleasant baritone. "Just remembering," Vilaine said with a small smile. "Remembering a choice I made in a swamp." He looked out at the lights of the village and the distant fires of the orcish mines in the mountains. He saw not two separate places, but one single, sprawling, messy, hopeful community. A family. And that is how a poor human and an orcish princess proved that family is a choice, not blood. If this story touched your heart, please smash that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories about compassion overcoming fear. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even a rusty key can open a future. Thanks for watching.